This is the chapter on oligopoly, which is the fourth market structure. We covered what pure competitors are, what the monopoly is, and monopolistic competition. And monopolistic competition and oligopoly have a lot of similarities. There are many of them. There are fewer in the oligopoly, but both of them advertise heavily and prefer people buy their products because they like it, not just because the price is cheaper. So let's look at some characteristics. A few large producers that may be homogeneous oligopoly, like the steel industry, rolled steel, or oil and gas, basically the same thing. Or it could be differentiated oligopoly, like the auto industry, and lots of different kinds of cars, airline industry, cereal industry, soft drinks, beer, a lot of oligopolies out there where you have a few large producers. So they do have control over price, but they have to very much be aware, more so than the monopolistic competitor, of the competitors because there's so few of them. If you need to ship something, you only have a few options, UPS or FedEx or the post office. So it's easy to check around and see which will give you the best deal. Of course, with the internet, it's easier with everything. But they are mutually interdependent, meaning that their profits depend on the strategies of others, and they also are characterized by strategic behavior. Their plan has to be based on the strategies of others as well, their business plan. So there are some entry barriers, mainly cost. It's very expensive to build an automobile plant, or certainly even more expensive to build an oil refinery. So cost is often a barrier to entry. And it may be that only a few can achieve economies of scale. Some oligopolies are made by mergers like ExxonMobil, AT&T, and Singular, and then currently T-Mobile and Sprint. So important question for firm concentration ratio: if the top 4 firms have 40% or more, then we consider it an oligopoly. But there are some shortcomings. Some have localized markets. And of course, we're looking at the United States concentration ratio, and many firms have competition from imports. So let's look at some examples. If you look down at the bottom right, motor vehicles, you see the top 4 firms have 60% of the market share in the U.S., and that would be Ford, General Motors, Toyota, and Chrysler. Nissan has 10%, so that could end up being a monopolistic competitor by definition if we end up with a more varied and more where the top 4 don't have actually 40%. That could end up being that way. And then if you look over on the left, cigarettes and beer, very high concentration ratios there. Anheuser-Busch is a very dominant firm in the beer industry, and then there's kind of everybody else. Electric light bulbs, there's only a few producers: Philips and Sylvania and General Electric, and there are not many others. Breakfast cereals, think about it. There are many, many, many different types of boxes of cereal, but they are mostly Kellogg's, Post, General Mills, or Quaker. So top 4 has 79% market share. But we also know that international competition does enter into some of these. So let's look at an example of what we call game theory with an oligopoly. And if some in the industry collude to fix prices, they can make higher profits. Problem is, of course, that's illegal in the United States. Well, let's look at an example. Let's say that we have 2 competitors for athletic shoes, and they, if they're both Rare Air and Uptown, using a high price strategy, they'll make the most profits. Those are profit numbers in those boxes. But then let's say Rare Air decides to develop a low price strategy in hopes of taking market share from Uptown, and that may happen. But of course, Uptown may respond by reducing their prices to take some market share back from Rare Air. They end up at the bottom right or the bottom with the lowest profits. So there's obviously an incentive to both keep the high price strategy, because if they independently lower prices, they're going to end up with the worst outcome. Somebody's going to have to agree to raise prices again because they're not going to accept those low profits forever. So there are 3 oligopoly models. The only thing you really need to know about the kinked demand curve is that generally, we'll look at that next, the assumed combined strategy at the bottom, they're likely to match price reductions. If a competitor lowers prices, they're likely to match those because they don't want to lose market share, but they'll ignore price increases of a competitor because maybe they'll gain some market share. So that would be considered a non-collusive oligopoly. So the criticisms of it explain that prices aren't that rigid. There is the possibility of a price war, and nobody really wants to get into that because it's just a race to the bottom. Somebody's going to have to raise prices again, and that may be harder to do. So looking at some other oligopoly models, the collusive pricing, and then the price leadership. So let's see. But looking at an example, if you have collusion, if you have a cartel, which is a group that gets together to fix prices or limit output, they can actually operate like a monopoly. If you look at this graph, it looks like a monopoly, producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but charging a high price that's still on the demand curve. If that price, of course, is above average total cost, they're making profits, in this case, quite a bit. But there's always the chance that somebody will cheat in the cartel. Cartel is a group of firms or nations that collude, formally agreeing to price the product at a certain price or set output levels that they can produce. It is illegal in the United States. Many companies have been fined tremendous fines by the Justice Department for colluding to fix prices or limit output. But probably the most famous cartel is the OPEC cartel, Organization Petroleum Exporting Countries, and these are the countries that are members. They have met for years to try to control the output of the world's oil. They have been, in the past, extremely powerful. They have lost much of that power. In April of 2020, we're seeing record low oil prices, very, very low oil prices. They just don't have the power they used to. Saudi Arabia is not the world's largest producer anymore. The United States is. The United States is the largest producer, followed by Saudi Arabia, and then Russia is a huge producer as well. And then that's followed by Iraq and Iran and Canada. So a lot of the top producing countries now are not in OPEC. So they don't have as much power as they used to. And the United States certainly is producing more than anybody now, and we're not as dependent on these countries. Venezuela down there, that was this was January of 2016, is producing much less than that now because they have moved toward becoming a socialist country, and they haven't put any money into their infrastructure, so they can't produce as much as they used to. And they're seeing some dire consequences in their economy. So obstacles to collusion, obviously you've got demand and cost differences. Different countries have different costs to produce, whether it's wages, access to land, access to minerals, and so on. Obviously, if there's a lot of firms in the industry, it's going to be impossible to get everybody to agree on something. OPEC countries have constantly cheated on each other. Also, during a recession, prices may go down to just be able to get rid of some output, and hopeful better times will be coming. And then there's nothing to prevent new entrants from coming into industry if it's profitable. So there's some obstacles besides just the fact that they are illegal in the United States. Collusion is illegal. So price leadership is just when you have one dominant firm that will initiate a price change, and usually the others just follow. Good example of this would be Anheuser-Busch. They're huge. Their market share is huge. If they raise prices, probably most of the rest of them are going to think we're not going to gain that much market share, so we'll just raise our prices too. So they may follow the leader in this. But also, the largest firms may use what we call limit pricing, and that is not charging the highest price possible because they want to discourage new firms from entering the industry. They're not charging the high price that may discourage others. Um, and nobody wants to get into a price war. It's a race to the bottom. So oligopolies compete through product development, developing their product, making it better because they have competition. They also advertise heavily. You know, a lot of the ads you see are for cereal and automobiles and well, in the insurance industry, those are really that's really a monopolistic industry. There are many insurers. But they do spend a lot on advertising, and they would much rather people buy their product because they prefer it, not because it's cheaper. And you cannot easily duplicate an ad campaign. Um, Price changes are easy. So most of these companies spend heavily on advertising, and it's a big part of their budgets. It is a way that they can actually benefit from economies of scale. They can spread that cost over many products. I mean, those Super Bowl ads are millions of dollars for 30 seconds, but look at the reach they have, the people they reach, and the buzz they create as people go online and look up those ads if they hear about them. So it can be a very low-cost way to provide information, especially with the internet now, and how easily it is to target certain market groups. But that means there's more competition out there, and that encourages technological progress as everyone tries to catch up with the ones that are popular. If there are any negative effects, well, these are the top advertisers, no surprise there. Any negative effects can be manipulative. Well, that's always, I mean, manipulative is subjective. That depends on consumers, obviously. Misleading claims are completely illegal. We learned that in the chapter on antitrust. Or well, the Wheeler-Lee Act prohibits deceptive advertising, and companies can be fined, ordered to stop the advertising if they're doing that. So you really don't see as much of that anymore. And consumers may be willing to pay higher prices if the good is in a better light by their advertising their product. If it's considered a really positive, they may be willing to pay higher prices for it. So that's a good thing for the business, not necessarily for consumers, but it is pretty easy to check out prices now with the internet and availability of price checkers and so on. So these are just the top 10 brand names recognized in the world. No surprise there again. Oligopolies, however, are not efficient producers. They are like monopolistic competitors, and the monopoly not efficient because their price is greater than minimum average total cost, and their price is greater than marginal cost. So they're not completely efficient. But we also have to be aware that a lot of them have competition from abroad, like the auto industry, airlines, and so on. The appliance manufacturers and so on. And we have to be aware that they may use limit pricing to discourage competitors from coming in. So that means they're not charging the necessarily the lowest price or the highest price. They want to limit those prices so that to discourage competitors from coming in. So let's see, the last thing in the chapter looks at internet access. That's another oligopoly. A few large firms that compete. Google and Facebook and Amazon, Microsoft, Apple compete for ads, and they're always looking to expand their market share a little bit. But we're seeing more and more of those things, just like when you look at movie streaming or streaming services. Netflix used to be the main one, and it's still got a huge market share, but there's so many others now that industry is becoming probably more of a monopolistic competitor than an oligopoly. So that wraps up that chapter.